I did not expect the night to end with the sound of my skull hitting concrete, yet the moment I stepped into the parking garage beneath our corporate headquarters, something inside me whispered that my brother had not asked me to meet him there to talk. The corridor lights flickered above the ramp leading down to the lower level, the same ramp we had walked together countless times as kids whenever Dad brought us to the office on weekends, but the way he stood waiting near the column marked B4 felt nothing like childhood. His shoulders were stiff, his chin angled upward with the same cold arrogance he carried into the boardroom earlier when the directors announced him as the new CEO of our family business a moment he believed was his coronation. I walked toward him slowly, still feeling the dull ache behind my eyes from hours of tension during that meeting where he barely looked at me except to signal that my presence was inconvenient. The air in the garage smelled like gasoline and cold metal, the kind of sharp industrial scent that makes everything feel more dangerous than it should be. He did not greet me. He did not ask if I was feeling better after the migraine that had hammered through my skull halfway through the meeting. He simply watched me with a strange mixture of triumph and irritation, like I was the last detail he needed to erase before stepping fully into his role. I stopped several feet away, close enough to see the way his jaw twitched. "What do you want?" "Jason," I asked, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. He smiled, but there was nothing warm in it. "I need you to understand your place now that I am running things," he said. It was the tone, not the words, that made something tighten in my chest, the same tone he used when we were teenagers and he realized our parents would always defend him no matter what he did. I told him I understood perfectly well how transitions work, that I had supported every CEO before him, that I had spent years keeping the company in compliance and managing the paperwork he never bothered to read. That was when his eyes darkened. "You think you matter," he said quietly, stepping closer. "You think you keep this place running, but you are just a signature. You are nothing without this company." The words landed with a familiar sting I thought I had outgrown. Yet, my throat tightened anyway, not from fear, but from the realization that he truly believed it. I turned slightly, intending to walk away because nothing about this conversation would stay rational, but he caught my elbow. His grip was not rough at first, just firm enough to stop me, yet there was an energy in his touch that made my pulse spike. "Jason, let go," I said, still keeping my voice low, but he stepped between me and the exit. "You do not get to walk away from me," he hissed. "Not tonight." The neon light above us buzzed as if it sensed the shift in the air. I could smell the faint warmth of engine oil from a nearby car that had just been parked, the residue floating in the stillness. I tried to reason with him, telling him we could continue the conversation tomorrow in a normal setting, but reasoning had never been something he valued when anger began to coil beneath his skin. He lifted his hand, not in a fist, not yet, but in a gesture I had seen before, one that always meant he wanted control more than he wanted conversation. I took a step back. He moved forward. "You are replaceable," he said sharply, the words slicing through the cold air. "You always were." Before I could respond, he shoved me. It was not a dramatic cinematic shove, not a throw or a swing, but a sudden violent burst of force from someone who knew he could overpower me. My foot hit a slick patch of oil on the concrete, and the moment I lost balance, I heard the echo of my own breath catching in my throat. Then the world tilted. The column rushed toward me faster than my body could react. The sound of impact was not loud but deep, like someone striking a hollow drum. A burst of hot light exploded behind my eyes and every muscle in my body went loose. I felt myself falling, though I could not tell how far or how fast. The cold concrete met my shoulder, then my hip, but none of it registered as pain, yet only pressure, distant and muted. Jason cursed under his breath, though his voice sounded strangely far away, as if he were standing at the end of a long hallway instead of right beside me. I tried to lift my hand, but it would not move. I tried to open my eyes, but the lights above blurred into streaks of white that pulsed and stretched. A faint ringing filled my ears. I could no longer tell the difference between air and ground. For a moment, I thought I heard him say something else, something sharp and panicked, but the words broke apart before they reached me. The garage lights dimmed. The world folded inward, and then everything went dark. When consciousness returned, it did not come in a clean sweep the way movies pretend it does. It arrived in fragments that did not belong to the same world. At first, the beeping of a monitor, the sterile smell of disinfectant, the faint murmur of voices behind a curtain, and the sensation that the back of my head had become an anchor pulling me deeper into the mattress. I blinked against the bright fluorescent light overhead, but the room continued to tilt as though gravity had come loose. A nurse appeared at my bedside, her face calm but focused in the way people look at someone who has survived something they are not yet ready to name. "You are in the emergency department," she said gently. "You took a hard fall." "How are you feeling?" I tried to answer, but the words tangled in my throat. The nurse leaned closer, her badge catching the white light. "I am going to ask you a few questions," she said, her tone softening as though she had switched modes. "Do you feel safe going home?" That question snapped something awake inside me. It felt too pointed, too direct, too real. Before I could think, another question followed. "Did someone hurt you?" I stared at her, my mind scrambling to stitch together the truth and the consequences of speaking it. Images flashed across the inside of my skull. Jason's face twisted with anger, the echo of the shove, the concrete column rushing toward me, the sickening thud. My stomach clenched. I opened my mouth, but the only thing that came out was a fractured breath. The nurse did not push. She waited like she had seen this moment hundreds of times before and knew that silence itself was an answer. I finally whispered, "I fell in the garage." It sounded unconvincing even to my own ears. She did not challenge it directly, but her eyes narrowed with a quiet skepticism that told me she had been trained to read the spaces between words. "Okay," she said carefully. "I hear you." She asked a few standard neurological questions. Did I know my name, the date, the city? I answered as steadily as I could, though my head felt stuffed with cotton. After a moment, she stepped away, and a social worker appeared at the foot of my bed, holding a clipboard. She introduced herself, but her words blurred together. All I caught was injury protocol and your right to report. She asked what happened. I repeated the lie, my voice a little stronger this time because it was rehearsed now. I slipped. I hit the column. The social worker paused, studying my expression the way someone might study handwriting looking for tremors or hesitation. She nodded slowly. "If you need help later," she said, "I will leave some information with the nurse." She left as quietly as she had come. My room settled into a heavy stillness broken only by the rhythmic beeping beside me. I tried to shift, but a wave of dizziness rolled through me. The curtain rustled a few minutes later, and my mother stepped in holding her purse like a shield. Her expression was tight, her voice too bright. "We told them you slipped, dear." The nurse nodded. She added quickly, as if needing to reassure me that the story had already been coordinated. "Family reputation first, truth somewhere far behind." My father stood behind her, hands in his pockets, jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitch from across the bed. They did not ask how I felt. They did not ask if I needed anything. They certainly did not ask what really happened. Instead, my father said the company is in a delicate position right now. We cannot have any misunderstandings. His voice was low-controlled, the same tone he used whenever he wanted compliance without debate. I stared at him, my throat thick. My mother touched my arm lightly. "Rest. Do not worry yourself. Jason is under pressure. He did not mean for things to escalate." The words rang in my ears not because of their content, but because of their familiarity. It was the same language she had used when Jason shoved a classmate in high school when he wrecked Dad's car and blamed a friend when he once grabbed my wrist so hard it bruised, and she said siblings fight. Now she said it again as though nothing in the world had changed except my ability to pretend this dynamic was harmless. They left quickly, not lingering long enough for the nurse to return. When she did, she looked at the doorway they disappeared through, then back at me. She set a small card on the rolling table beside my bed, sliding it forward with 2 fingers. "This is just information," she said, keeping her tone neutral and professional. "You do not have to do anything with it." The card was for a domestic violence hotline. The edges were crisp, like it had been set there for countless patients who had whispered the same lie I had. Something in my chest tightened. I thanked her, though my voice felt hollow. She checked the monitors, adjusted the blanket over my legs, and then paused. If anything changes or if you remember something differently later, we are here. No judgment, just safety. After she left, the quiet became unbearable. I stared at the ceiling, tracing invisible cracks that were not there, trying to ground myself in something real. My head throbbed with a dull ache, but the deeper pain was the realization that my family had arrived at the hospital not to protect me, but to protect the narrative. Their version of events had moved faster than the truth. Their loyalty was not to my safety, but to the company, to Jason, to the image they had curated for decades. I closed my eyes, the bruised weight at the back of my skull pulsing in slow waves. I thought about the nurse's questions, the way she had not believed my answer, the way she still protected my right to speak later. For the first time since the impact, I felt something small and sharp inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something colder. Something like clarity. The week after the hospital felt like moving through a house where every door was slightly open, but no one inside wanted to speak above a whisper. It was the kind of silence that did not comfort, but controlled, a silence crafted intentionally to push reality beneath the floorboards where no one would have to acknowledge it. I returned to my apartment with a dizzy heaviness still clinging to me, the bruise on the back of my head turning shades of deep purple and sickly yellow, a pulsing reminder that the moment in the parking garage had not been a nightmare. Yet no one called to ask how I was handling the concussion, whether I was eating or whether the headaches were getting worse. Not my parents, not my brother, not even my aunt, who normally checked in whenever one of us caught a cold. The only communication I received was a brief text from Jason 2 days after the incident that read, "Let's keep this professional," as if my skull hitting concrete was an office misunderstanding, as if being shoved until unconsciousness was simply an inconvenience that needed to be filed under workplace etiquette. The words burned through me, not because of what he said, but because of what he did not say. No apology, no acknowledgement, no concern. Only an instruction meant to seal the entire event in silence. The message confirmed what I already felt forming around me at the hospital the moment my parents repeated the lie they had chosen before I even woke up. The family had decided the story. I had slipped. The end. No variables allowed, no deviations tolerated. On the 3rd day of that week, my father sent a short email instructing me to work from home until further notice. No greeting. No inquiry about my recovery, just a directive that carried the weight of corporate policy thinly disguised as parental concern. It reminded me of the conversations he used to have with us as children whenever something risky happened, the kind where he spoke about responsibility and reputation as if they were identical concepts. Except now, the words felt harsher, colder, more self-preserving. My mother called once not to ask how I felt, but to remind me not to speak to anyone outside the family about the fall. She did not phrase it as a warning. She said it as if she were doing me a favor, as if she believed my silence protected me too. "Sweetheart, the company is about to roll out a major partnership," she said. "We cannot risk misunderstandings or gossip. People talk, they twist things. Best to let it go. Let it go." The phrase sat in my stomach like a stone. I hung up feeling smaller than I had the night of the fall, smaller even than the girl who used to sit on the stairs listening to my parents comfort Jason after every mistake he made while telling me to toughen up. That week, I also noticed a shift in the way colleagues interacted with me. Emails were clipped formal and overly polite. Meetings I had been invited to for years suddenly had new attendees or were postponed without explanation. No one asked why I had missed the last board presentation. No one mentioned the parking garage or the hospital. The absence of questions was louder than any inquiry would have been. It told me they all knew something had happened and had collectively agreed to behave as if ignorance was professionalism. People in corporate environments claim to value transparency, but they value stability far more. If pretending helps the structure hold, they will pretend until the walls crumble. So I worked in silence, replying to compliance queries, updating regulatory logs, reviewing vendor renewals, all while trying to steady the dizziness that flared every time I looked at the screen for too long. My body was healing more slowly than I wanted it to, but the emotional numbness lingered even longer. There was one moment that broke through the haze. On the fifth morning of that week, I woke to the sound of a car door slamming outside my apartment complex. The noise was ordinary mundane, but it made my whole body tense with a fear that felt disproportionate yet real. For a split second, I thought Jason was standing outside, waiting in the same way he had waited in the garage, expecting me to appear so he could finish the conversation he believed he had the right to control. When I realized the sound belonged to someone else entirely, I sank onto the couch, shaking in a way I could not justify with logic alone. I hated that he still had that kind of power over my nervous system. I hated even more that my family did not seem to care. At the end of that week, I finally received a call from HR, though it was not really a call of concern. It was a scheduled check-in meant to confirm that I had reported a workplace slip and foul language so sanitized it almost made me laugh. The representative asked the required questions in a polite monotone, her voice carrying the well-trained neutrality of someone who is prepared to log whatever the employee says and never dig beyond the surface. She asked if I needed accommodations, if I required a temporary change to my workload, and whether I had any concerns about safety. Every question dangled in the air with the same unspoken hope that I would simply say no and close the case. And I did. I said no. No issues, no concerns, no unsafe environment. The lies came out of my mouth without resistance because the system around me had already decided the truth was inconvenient. It was not until after I hung up that I realized something had shifted inside me. The numbness that had carried me through the week began to thin, replaced by a slow-burning clarity. If they were willing to bury what happened to protect the company, then I needed to remember something I had apparently forgotten. I was part of the company too, and not in the disposable way they treated me. I held a position they did not understand, one tied directly to the laws they depended on. They wanted silence, because silence kept Jason safe. But silence also gave me space to think. And thinking was the one thing they had underestimated my entire life. In the quiet days that followed, as I drifted between managing my lingering headaches and keeping up with the work no one else understood, I found myself thinking not about the fall itself, but about the person who had pushed me. People like to pretend that violence appears suddenly like a switch flipping in a moment of rage. But that is not how it happens. Violence grows in small, unchallenged spaces. It begins in the softness of excuses, in the gentle rewriting of memories, in the way a family protects the child who causes harm rather than the one who absorbs it. Jason did not become dangerous the night he became CEO. He had always been that way. Power did not change him. It revealed him. I remembered the first time he shoved me. We were children barely old enough to tie our shoes correctly, and he pushed me off the small wooden platform in our backyard because I had climbed it before he did. I cried not because it hurt, but because I knew he would never admit he was wrong. When our mother came outside and saw me on the ground, Jason told her I had slipped. She believed him instantly, or maybe she wanted to believe him, because it was easier to treat boys as rough and girls as overdramatic. Either way, that was the moment the pattern began. Every time he lashed out, the adults around us smoothed the edges of the truth, insisting it was normal sibling conflict or harmless frustration. Those excuses shaped him more than any consequence ever could have. In high school, he got into a fight behind the gym and broke another student's nose. The school called our parents expecting outrage or at least accountability, but instead they argued that he had been provoked and that the other boy should have stepped aside. Jason was suspended for 3 days. During those days, my mother baked his favorite meals and my father lectured him on leadership, not violence, telling him that people would always challenge strong men. I remembered sitting in the hallway listening to that conversation and realizing that the rules I had been taught did not apply equally. When I misbehaved even slightly, I was corrected swiftly and thoroughly. When Jason misbehaved, he was defended with such intensity that the lesson he learned was not restraint, but entitlement. He carried that entitlement through college, where he treated group projects like tasks meant for others to complete. When he failed a class, his first instinct was to blame the professor. When his girlfriend broke up with him, he said she did not appreciate ambition. When he lost an internship because he forgot a deadline, he claimed the company was disorganized. The world was never something he interacted with. It was something he expected to bend. Our father fed that belief. He often called Jason the future of the company, even though Jason never expressed genuine interest in the details of how it worked. He liked the idea of being in charge, the image of authority, not the responsibility that came with it. My role was different. I was the one who stayed late reading regulatory updates. I was the one who built relationships with hospital compliance teams and learned every requirement our contracts depended on. I was the one our father called when the audit notices arrived. Yet in family conversations, I was still spoken about as the helper, the detail-oriented one, the person who would support Jason when he took over. Support was a polite word. What they meant was invisible. The more invisible I became, the more invincible he felt. That is why the moment he was named CEO felt less like a transition and more like a shift in gravity. He walked into the boardroom that morning with a swagger I had never seen before, shaking hands with the directors and making promises he was not equipped to keep. When he glanced at me across the table, there was a spark in his eyes, something sharp and territorial, like he believed he had finally inherited not a role, but ownership of every person in the room. I watched him speak confidently about strategic growth and operational restructuring, using words he barely understood, and I could see the board members nodding politely. Most of them did not know who actually managed the compliance systems that kept us from being shut down. Most did not know I existed beyond the name on the reports they skimmed. Jason counted on that anonymity. He had always assumed that because he was louder, because he took up more space, because he commanded attention, even when he did not deserve it, the company would follow his lead without question. That belief is what followed us into the parking garage that night. The violence did not surprise me. The escalation did. As I lay awake during that week after the hospital replaying the sound of my skull hitting concrete, I realized something that chilled me more than the memory itself. He had not checked to see if I was breathing. He had not called for help. He had not panicked out of concern. He had panicked because he feared consequences. That distinction mattered because it meant he never saw me as a sister or even a person. I was an obstacle. And obstacles were meant to be handled, not protected. Power did not corrupt him. It freed him from the small restraints he had once pretended to respect. It unlocked parts of him that had been waiting coiled just beneath the surface. I understood then why my parents had insisted so quickly that the fall was an accident. Acknowledging the truth would shatter the myth they had built around him. It would expose the cracks they had plastered over for decades. It would force them to confront the reality that the heir they had chosen, the son they believed would lead the company forward, had just revealed himself incapable of leading even his own impulses. And in their world, appearances mattered more than accountability. That realization did not spark rage. Not yet. What it sparked was clarity, a clarity that cut through the lingering dizziness and through the fog of silence that surrounded me. They were all blind to the consequences of their choices. But I was not. And unlike them, I understood the systems they depended on. I understood how fragile their structure actually was. I understood that the very thing they took for granted was the thing that would eventually unravel them. They just had not realized it yet. For most of my life, I existed in the quiet corners of our family business, the places where important things happened without applause, where mistakes could cost millions, yet successes rarely earned more than a brief nod from someone who assumed the outcome had been inevitable. People outside the company often thought my job title meant I printed labels or reviewed forms, something administrative that required patience but not expertise. They had no idea what it meant to be the compliance officer of record in a healthcare logistics company, how many federal regulations were woven into every shipment, or how many hospital networks required personal verification from me before approving our contracts each year. If the company were a body, Jason liked to imagine himself as the brain, but I was the spine, the part that held everything upright, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. I never sought recognition for it. I did not need my name engraved on plaques or my achievements recited during board meetings. I valued precision, stability, and order, the satisfaction of preventing disasters before they formed. I was the one who read regulations line by line, the one who spotted minor inconsistencies in vendor compliance reports, the one who reorganized credentialing files so our hospital partnerships would not lapse. I did not brag about any of this because the work itself demanded humility. It demanded patience and vigilance, and an understanding that the most critical tasks were often invisible. People do not praise the absence of explosions, only the presence of fireworks. When I joined the company after college, my father placed me in the compliance department because it was the only department no one else wanted. It was considered tedious, thankless work, the kind suited to someone who followed rules more easily than they created them. Jason laughed when he heard the assignment and told me it was fitting for someone who enjoyed paperwork more than ambition. At the time, I let the comment slide. I believed if I did the work well enough, the contributions would eventually speak for themselves. I did not understand yet how loudly entitlement could drown out merit. Over the years, I became the person every department relied on without fully realizing it. When the FDA sent out policy updates, I was the one who interpreted them. When hospital networks introduced new credentialing requirements, I was the one who submitted updated documentation. When a shipment needed an urgent override, or when an auditor requested additional proof of chain of custody, they came to me. They did not ask Jason because he did not know the details and made no effort to learn them. To him, details were obstacles. To me, they were the architecture that held the business together. I learned early on that compliance was not about paperwork. It was about responsibility. As the authorized signatory, my name appeared on dozens of legal documents binding the company to requirements that could not be broken without consequence. My signature authorized shipments of temperature-sensitive devices to hospitals across the region. My signature verified that we met regulatory standards. My signature confirmed that the company had followed every mandated procedure. People underestimated how much power lived in a signature. People underestimated how much risk, too. What they also underestimated, perhaps most of all, was how much of the company's eligibility depended not on the brand name or the leadership image, but on the person who held the certifications required to operate legally. Jason never asked how any of it worked. He assumed operations ran through him because leadership had always been handed to him without question. He did not understand that replacing me would trigger a months-long recredentialing process across multiple hospital systems. He did not understand that my role was verified annually through external agencies that did not care about family politics. He did not know that the compliance officer of record could not be swapped casually, not in our industry, not for a company our size, not without risking suspensions or audits that could shut down entire segments of the business. I did not hold this knowledge as leverage, at least not intentionally. I held it because it was my job. It was my responsibility. It was the role I had taken on quietly, consistently, and with the kind of discipline Jason had always dismissed as passivity. What he saw as meekness was in reality the foundation of authority. Quiet authority is easy to overlook when you do not understand its purpose. That was why the board rarely acknowledged my contributions. They saw tidy reports, smooth audits, and stable partnerships, and assumed those outcomes were automatic. They saw Jason speaking confidently in meetings and assumed he led us forward. They did not see the hours I spent reviewing compliance logs when others were asleep, the late-night calls with hospital credentialing departments when deadlines changed, or the last-minute corrections that prevented penalties. They did not see the way I ensured every regulation was followed, so that no one ever had to face consequences beyond inconvenience. I never complained about being invisible because invisibility protected me too. While Jason absorbed all the attention, I absorbed all the knowledge. While he sought power, I learned how the machinery of the company actually worked. While he performed leadership, I practiced responsibility. My parents used to tell me I was the steady one, the reliable one, the one who did not need praise to function. They said it lovingly, as though stability were a compliment, but stability without acknowledgement can become a trap. They relied on me because I was dependable, and they dismissed me because I did not demand to be seen. It took years for me to realize those two things were connected, and it took the parking garage to realize that my quiet role did not make me weak. It made me essential. Essential in a way Jason could never replace. Essential in a way my family had never bothered to understand. Essential in a way that would matter soon far more than they expected. As I sat at my dining table a week after the fall, reviewing a stack of incoming credentialing notices with one hand pressed gently to the bruise behind my ear, I understood something with complete clarity. They had built a structure that depended on the work I did in the shadows. and they had no idea how fragile that structure was. In the second week after the fall, when the dizziness had lessened enough for me to look at a computer screen without the room tilting sideways, I began to fully grasp the part of the situation Jason had never understood. The part he had never bothered to learn, the part that would unravel everything he believed he controlled. He thought leadership was about authority, about tone, about posture in a boardroom, about how confidently he could shake hands, or how loudly he could speak during strategic meetings. He thought power lived in his title and in the echo of his name on the office door. But the system we worked in, the healthcare logistics industry that kept hospitals supplied and compliant with regulations they could not afford to violate, did not care about charisma or family pedigree. It cared about documentation credentials, legal authorization, and the signature of the person who was willing to carry the weight of responsibility. That person was me. And the system required me in ways Jason never paused long enough to imagine. On the surface, our company operated like any mid-size regional logistics provider, managing the delivery of equipment and devices to hospitals and clinics across the state. But beneath the surface, under layers of contracts and federal requirements, we functioned as a regulated partner, not a casual vendor. Every shipment we handled passed through a chain of compliance that included temperature controls, verification protocols, and legal documentation. Every partnership with a hospital required a named compliance officer of record, someone who had undergone background checks, federal screenings, and credentialing through third-party agencies that conducted annual audits. My name was on those contracts because I had spent years building that trust with compliance teams. I completed every required certification, reviewed every audit notice, and submitted every renewal packet. I never treated these responsibilities as optional, but Jason never treated them as real. He saw my work as clerical, something that happened behind the scenes, without consequence, something he could reshuffle at will once he became CEO. The problem, the one he failed to see even after the hospital week passed, was that compliance roles are not simple job titles. They are legal identities. The authorized signatory on federal filings cannot be replaced casually. When the named compliance officer changes, the company does not simply update a form and continue operations. It must enter recredentialing, a process that involves 30 to 60 days of review for smaller hospitals and up to 120 days for major networks. During this time, certain shipments cannot be processed, contracts cannot be renewed, audits cannot be closed, and in some cases, the company cannot legally operate pending approval. Jason had never attended a single credentialing meeting. He had never read the fine print on a single federal requirement. He believed he could walk into the office, fire me, or push me to resign and replace me with someone he found agreeable or more loyal. He did not realize that without a credentialed officer in place, our entire hospital network would freeze operations. He did not realize hospitals flagged leadership changes immediately, even subtle ones, and expected compliance statements within strict time frames. He did not realize that federal contracts require continuity of oversight, and any breach could trigger audits we were not prepared to handle. Most of all, he did not realize that I had always been the one carrying the compliance keys, and those keys did not automatically transfer to whoever he appointed next. I did not set this structure intentionally to use it as leverage someday. It existed because the industry demanded it. It existed because hospitals needed accountability. And it existed because my father, in all his reliance on family legacy, trusted me to take on a role he believed was tedious but necessary. He never realized how necessary. Jason certainly never realized. On the Wednesday of week 2, the first signs appeared. A hospital compliance manager emailed me after noticing discrepancies in our corporate filings. She referenced a system alert triggered when Jason registered himself as the leadership contact without including a compliance verification. I replied with the standard professional explanation that I was still the compliance officer and authorized signatory of record, and that any leadership change would require updated filings submitted through the official channels. I provided the necessary documents, CCing our internal counsel. Jason was not included because he had never been part of that process. I thought that would be the end of it. But by Friday, 4 more hospitals reached out, 2 requesting updated credentialing packets, and 1 asking why the CEO had responded to an automated request with incomplete information. I answered what I could, submitted what was required, and flagged the discrepancies for legal. The questions were routine, but the pattern was not. They were all noticing the same thing, a change in leadership without the compliance updates to support it. Jason had triggered the system without realizing how closely it watched. On Monday of week 3, a compliance audit coordinator from a major hospital network called directly. She asked to speak to me because she had received conflicting communications from our company, one from Jason declaring himself the primary contact, and one from me confirming that compliance oversight remained unchanged. She wanted to know whether the company had undergone an internal restructuring. She asked whether new compliance officers had been appointed. She asked whether I still held signatory authority. I confirmed the truth. Yes, I remained the compliance officer. Yes, I remained the authorized signatory. Yes, I remained the point of contact for all regulatory filings. She paused. We will need written confirmation, she said carefully. And if leadership has changed, we will need new verification from our legal department. She was calm but firm, the tone of someone who had seen companies collapse under mismanaged transitions. I promised to follow up. After the call, I sat in silence for several long minutes, staring at the bruise still faintly visible on my forearm. It struck me then with a clarity that felt almost clinical that the system was doing what people had failed to do. It noticed. It asked questions. It demanded truth where my family had demanded silence. Jason believed power meant being untouchable, but the system he underestimated was built on rules, not ego. It did not care about family narratives or image preservation. It did not care that my father believed his son would lead us forward. It did not care that my mother believed loyalty mattered more than accountability. It cared only about compliance validity and legal authorization, and it recognized my name. Jason's mistake was not the shove itself, though that would carry consequences in its own way. His mistake was assuming he could replace the person who held the authority to keep the company functioning. His mistake was assuming that violence would silence me rather than activate the safeguards he had ignored. His mistake was assuming that the system bowing to him meant every system would. They would not. And the one system he never bothered to understand was about to show him exactly how fragile his new power really was. By the time week 3 unfolded into a blur of compliance alerts and quiet phone calls with hospital networks, Jason finally realized something was happening that he could not control. It did not come from a moral awakening or any sense of responsibility. It came from frustration, pure ego, bruised frustration. He called me on a Tuesday afternoon, his voice clipped and rehearsed, like he had practiced sounding authoritative before dialing. "We need to talk," he said. I recognized the tone instantly, the same tone he used whenever he believed someone had failed him. I told him I was working and that any operational concerns should go through the correct channels. He did not appreciate that. "You are being dramatic," he snapped. "We can handle this like adults." Adults? I thought the word almost laughable coming from the man who shoved me so hard my skull hit concrete. But I kept my voice calm as I told him to send an email outlining whatever issue he believed required my attention. He did not like that answer either. He hung up without another word. Minutes later, the email arrived. It was shorter than expected. "We cannot have hospitals contacting you directly. You answer only through my office. You do not speak on behalf of the company unless I authorize it. You are replaceable." That last line sat on the screen longer than the others, as if the words themselves demanded more attention. Replaceable. The word that had slipped from his mouth in the parking garage before his hands found my arm, before the concrete met the back of my skull. The word he clung to because it helped him believe he was the one with power. It took a long breath before I realized I was not angry. I was not even hurt. What I felt was something different, something steadier, something far more dangerous to him. Clarity. He believed I was replaceable because he believed compliance worked the same way boardroom politics did. He believed authority came from titles, not the responsibilities woven into legal frameworks. He believed his new CEO status meant he could dictate the rules without understanding that he was not the one the system reported to. He thought he could erase me with a signature. He forgot compliance does not work on ego. He forgot credentials cannot be willed into existence. He forgot hospital networks do not adjust their legal requirements to accommodate family drama. He forgot the company could not process certain shipments if my authorization was removed prematurely. He forgot that every audit in progress listed my name as the responsible officer. He forgot that federal filings referenced my identity, not his. He forgot that without my verifications, the entire operational chain stalled. He forgot that he had built his new authority on top of a foundation he had never examined. And he forgot one more thing, the one thing that mattered more than any system or title. I no longer feared him. The fall had taken that from him. He had used violence believing it would intimidate me. Instead, it stripped him of the one advantage he always held over me, the quiet expectation that I would protect him, protect the family, protect the name, protect the image. That expectation died on the garage floor. I drafted a reply to his message. Not emotional, not reactive, simply factual. Jason Hospitals are contacting me because I am the current compliance officer of record. Until credentialing transitions are completed, I cannot be replaced. Please review our existing contracts and federal requirements. All compliance communications must be accurate and submitted through correct channels. He responded within minutes. Do not lecture me. Do not act like you have leverage here. We can find someone else with your certifications. You are not special. There it was again. That insistence that I was interchangeable, that the years I spent building relationships, credentials, and audit histories were something he could simply duplicate out of spite. I did not argue. Arguing with Jason had always been like shouting into an empty room. Instead, I documented the exchange, forwarded the emails to legal, and returned to my work. That evening, as fatigue settled into my bones, I thought about how strange it was that a single moment of violence had shifted the balance so completely. I had spent years believing that maintaining peace was my responsibility, that protecting the company meant absorbing the ways my family dismissed my role. But now, watching Jason flail against a system he did not understand, I realized something vital. It had never been my job to shield him from consequences. It had never been my job to remain silent so he could appear competent. It had never been my job to preserve an illusion that had been built on favoritism and denial. My job was compliance. My job was accuracy. My job was truth. And the truth was that the system recognized my position even if my family never had. Jason forgot one thing. He forgot the only power he ever truly had was the power other people gave him. He forgot how much of his life depended on the assumption that I would never step out of the shadows. He forgot I had stopped protecting him. And soon he would learn what happens when the person holding the structure together is pushed too far to quietly remain in place. Week 2 began with a stillness that felt manufactured, like the quiet that settles over a neighborhood right before a storm makes landfall. No one mentioned the fall. No one mentioned the hospital. No one mentioned the fact that I had not returned to the office because dizzy spells still rolled through me if I turned my head too quickly. Instead, the silence took on a new texture, one shaped not by avoidance, but by tension, the kind that makes the air feel heavy even when the sky outside is clear. On Monday morning, I logged in from my dining table, my laptop surrounded by compliance binders and half-filled water bottles left from nights when I was too tired to finish them. I expected a routine day of reports and regulatory filings. Instead, I found 3 messages waiting, all from different hospital compliance teams, all flagged urgent. The first asked for verification of leadership updates. The second requested clarification about conflicting communications. The third asked whether I was still the compliance officer of record and whether I remained the authorized signatory for all active contracts. These were not routine questions. These were questions triggered by someone attempting to overwrite established authority without proper documentation, someone who believed a title alone could rewrite the structure of an industry. The only person reckless enough to do that was Jason. I drafted careful responses, each one factual and neutral, each one confirming that I remained the compliance officer of record until credentialing transitions were processed. I knew the tone mattered as much as the content. Compliance was not a field that tolerated emotional narratives. It tolerated only accuracy. As I typed, a small ache pulsed behind my right temple, a reminder of the garage floor and the moment everything shifted. But the clarity that had settled in the days after the fall guided my fingers. I did not hide what needed to be stated. I did not soften my explanations. I did not protect Jason from the consequences of his confusion. I submitted updated forms. I notified legal. I documented everything. By mid-morning, the questions multiplied. A message from a regional hospital system noted that their automated credentialing review had detected a possible leadership conflict. They asked me to confirm the effective date of any corporate restructuring. They asked for a copy of the board resolution if one existed. They asked whether a new officer had been appointed to replace me. Their tone was calm, but their wording was precise. They already suspected noncompliance. They were giving us the opportunity to clarify before escalating. Jason had no idea what he had triggered. He thought leadership changes were internal politics. He thought hospitals simply wanted names for mailing lists. He did not understand that compliance systems work like seismic monitors, sensitive to the smallest shift, alerting long before the structure collapses. That afternoon, legal forwarded a message from an auditor who had flagged our account for review due to conflicting signatures. Apparently, Jason had attempted to sign something he was not authorized to sign, and the system recognized the mismatch. The signature did not match the required credentialed officer of record. My name did. I reviewed the flagged document and saw exactly what had happened. Jason had tried to assert control. The system refused him. I submitted a corrective notice attaching the proper forms and waited for confirmation. Instead of confirmation, I received a call. The compliance director of a major hospital network requested a phone meeting. Her voice was steady, the voice of a woman who had been doing this work long enough to recognize the subtleties of corporate dysfunction. She asked not what happened, but why it happened. She asked why the CEO was communicating directly with credentialing departments. She asked why my signature was missing from several digital submissions filed earlier that week. She asked why leadership changes had not been reported through the required channels within the mandated time frame. She asked questions the way surgeons examine wounds, probing gently but thoroughly. I told her the truth. Not about the garage, not about the fall, not about the shove, not about the concussion. I told her the truth about compliance. I told her I remained the authorized signatory until transitions were properly filed. I told her that any communications lacking my verification should be treated as incomplete. I told her the documentation she required would be submitted. She paused before saying that she appreciated clarity and that she hoped our leadership team understood the importance of maintaining regulatory alignment. It was the politest warning I had ever received. After the call, I sat back and let the weight of the situation settle over me. Jason believed my role was administrative. He believed he could replace me overnight. He believed compliance functioned the same way he imagined authority functioned. But now, the system had begun asking questions, and each question pulled another thread. Hospitals documented concerns. Auditors logged discrepancies. Credentialing platforms tracked leadership conflicts. None of this required my intervention. It was automatic. The system was responding to him exactly as it was designed to respond to risk. By Tuesday afternoon, legal sent an internal notice requesting a meeting between me, Jason, and our corporate counsel. I declined, stating medical recovery and remote work restrictions. Instead, I provided documentation of every issue raised by hospitals. Legal replied with a cautious tone, one that hinted they did not fully understand what was happening but sensed the danger. Meanwhile, Jason began sending messages that switched between condescending and panicked. One read, "Stop responding directly to hospitals." Another said, "You do not understand the position you are putting us in." A third said, "You are blowing this out of proportion." And then the last message, the one that revealed everything he feared without admitting any fault. "Fix it." That was all it said. Fix it. The demand of a man who had built his life on the expectation that someone else would clean up after him. I did not reply. Not because I was angry, because there was nothing to fix. What was happening was not an error. It was a system recognizing a breach, and breaches had consequences. On Wednesday morning, a hospital compliance coordinator emailed legal copying me stating that our failure to provide updated signatory documentation could result in temporary suspension of our credentialing status. It was not a threat. It was a procedural outcome. If Jason had read even one contract in the last 5 years, he would have known this. Instead, Legal forwarded the message to him. He called me within minutes, shouting into the phone, his voice cracking with frustration. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "You are sabotaging us." His US sounded strange. It no longer felt like I belonged to that pronoun. I told him calmly that I had done nothing except comply with federal requirements. I told him he needed to review the contracts instead of reacting emotionally. He cursed and hung up. That evening, as I sat alone with my laptop glowing in the dim living room light, something settled inside me, something that felt both steady and inevitable. The system was asking questions because it had noticed the imbalance. It had noticed the inconsistencies. It had noticed the leadership change that had not been verified. It had noticed because noticing was its job. And for the first time in my life, I did not have to fight to be heard. The system was speaking for me. And Jason, who had always relied on silence to protect him, had no idea how to answer. By week 4, the situation had grown too large for anyone to pretend it was simply a misunderstanding, too loud for Jason to bury beneath his usual charm, too structural for my parents to smooth over with reassuring phone calls and family-preferred narratives. The compliance discrepancies that had begun as questions were now logged as formal concerns, and each concern carried a timestamp and a digital trail that not even the most image-conscious executive could ignore. I woke that Monday to an email from legal requesting immediate clarification on which compliance documents were overdue and why the hospital systems had not yet received updated signatory verification. The wording revealed their unfamiliarity with the underlying issue. They still assumed it was administrative something that could be corrected quickly if I simply provided the right forms. They did not yet understand that the delays were the natural result of Jason attempting to alter leadership structure without notifying the correct agencies. The emails continued throughout the morning. One hospital system escalated its inquiry requesting a full review of our credentialing status with an explicit note that incomplete filings could result in temporary suspension of our eligibility to deliver critical equipment. Another hospital, the one we relied on for 20% of our regional revenue, sent a formal notice titled Contractual Risk Exposure. They were not threatening. They were informing. The system had moved to the next stage. Jason still believed this was something I could quietly fix before the board learned how badly he had mishandled the transition. He did not realize the board had already been notified. I learned this when corporate counsel called and asked me to provide a detailed timeline of every communication I had handled since the leadership change. Her voice held that calm urgency lawyers use when they are preparing for fallout, the kind of tone that means the consequences are no longer theoretical. She asked for every email, every compliance alert, every hospital question, every corrective filing. She asked whether I had documentation proving that I informed Jason he could not replace the compliance officer without initiating the credentialing process. I did. I had copies of everything. When I finished explaining the situation, she was silent for several seconds, not in disbelief, but in confirmation. I could almost hear her reorganizing her strategy as the weight of what she had learned settled into place. "Thank you," she finally said. "The board will need to speak with you." Jason did not contact me that entire day. By Tuesday morning, an email arrived from the board secretary requesting my presence at an emergency meeting scheduled for Friday. The message was formal, sterile, and unmistakably serious. Emergency board meetings were rare. One involving compliance was unheard of. My parents called that evening. My father's voice was clipped controlled, the same tone he used whenever he wanted to discuss the company without acknowledging conflict. "There is a board meeting Friday," he said, as though I had not received the email. I answered quietly, "Yes, I know." There was a strained pause before he added, "The board will want to understand how this happened." The word "this" carried more weight than he intended. He meant the compliance crisis, the system failures, the questions piling up from hospitals. But I heard something else beneath his tone, something that sounded like fear. Fear not for me, but for Jason. He asked me what I planned to say. I told him the truth. I would explain the credentialing requirements. I would explain the leadership change policies. I would explain the timelines. I would explain how the system reacts when unauthorized individuals attempt to override established authority. I would explain everything. My father was silent long enough that I wondered whether the call had dropped. Then he spoke in that careful, measured voice he reserved for moments when he needed loyalty more than honesty. "Be mindful of your words," he said. "The company is vulnerable. We cannot let this become bigger than it needs to be." I almost laughed. Bigger than it needs to be. As though the system had asked questions because it enjoyed drama. As though hospitals threatened suspension because of personal dislike. As though I had created this crisis instead of warning Jason repeatedly that credentialing cannot be manipulated by arrogance. But I stayed quiet because arguing with him had never resulted in anything except exhaustion. When Friday arrived, I dressed slowly, choosing a simple blouse and blazer, because I refused to step into the boardroom appearing like a victim or a threat. I wanted to look exactly like what I was, a professional, a compliance officer, someone whose work relied on precision, not theatrics. When I entered the conference room, the tension was already thick enough to feel through the air. Jason sat at the far end of the table, his jaw clenched, his eyes narrow with a mix of anger and fear. My parents sat beside him, both stiff, both avoiding my gaze. The board members murmured quietly until the chair called the meeting to order. The corporate counsel began by summarizing the situation. She outlined the hospital concerns, the credentialing flags, the suspended audits, the discrepancies detected in our filings. She presented everything calmly, methodically, as though she were reading the weather forecast instead of informing the board that the company was now at risk of losing its eligibility to operate. Then she asked me to explain. So I did. I explained the credentialing timeline. I explained the federal requirements. I explained the legal implications of appointing a new compliance officer. I explained the gaps created by Jason's unilateral attempts to change leadership without completing the required filings. I explained how the system reacted. I explained why hospitals had escalated. I explained why the company was now facing suspension risks. I did not raise my voice. I did not blame him. I simply presented the truth. When I finished, the boardroom was silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of people unsure what to say. The heavy silence of people realizing they had entrusted authority to someone who had no idea how the company functioned beneath the surface. One board member finally turned to Jason. "Did you review any of the compliance documentation before making changes to the leadership records?" He stiffened. It was supposed to be straightforward. Another member asked why he had signed documents requiring authorized oversight. He insisted he had not known it mattered. The counsel gently reminded him that ignorance is not a valid defense in compliance-based industries. Jason's face reddened. He tried to redirect blame. He said I had withheld information. He said I was being emotional. He said I was amplifying minor issues to embarrass him. The counsel corrected him calmly. Nothing she submitted was exaggerated. Everything she documented has been verified. When Jason continued arguing, the board chair raised his hand. "Enough." The word echoed across the table with a finality that made Jason's jaw snap shut. The board conferred privately for several minutes. When they returned, they announced their decision. An external audit would be initiated. Compliance oversight would remain under my authority until transitions were completed correctly. Jason would be placed under review for failure to adhere to legal requirements. The look on Jason's face told me he had not expected consequences. Not truly. Not ever. My father stared down at the table, his expression tight. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line. The meeting concluded with the board instructing Jason to refrain from making any further changes until council approved them. For the first time in his life, he had been publicly reprimanded. Not by family. Not by me. By people he wanted to impress. As I left the room, the realization settled over me with quiet certainty. The silence that had protected him for years was gone. The board could no longer ignore the truth. And once truth enters a system built on documentation, it leaves a trail that cannot be erased. In the weeks that followed the emergency board meeting, the consequences of that night in the parking garage finally began to take shape, not in a dramatic explosion, but in the slow, methodical tightening of a system that had been patient for far too long. I had spent most of my life watching my family treat accountability like an inconvenience, something to be sidestepped with charm excuses or selective retellings. But systems built on documentation do not bend for charm, and systems built on legality do not care about family narratives. They follow process. They follow evidence. and evidence had finally begun to converge around Jason in a way that could not be smoothed over by anyone's pride. 2 weeks after the board meeting, I received a voicemail from the compliance director of one of our top hospital networks asking whether my medical records from the emergency room could be forwarded for their internal review. The request was not personal, it was procedural. They had flagged leadership misconduct as a potential operational risk and were gathering information to determine whether the company remained a safe partner. I sat on the edge of my bed, listening to her words twice before the weight of what she was really asking settled in. She wanted documentation of injury, documentation of the incident, documentation that could not be dismissed as exaggeration or misunderstanding. For the first time since the garage, I realized my medical file did not belong solely to my personal history anymore. It now intersected with the company's regulatory obligations, and that intersection meant something had to be done formally. The next morning, with hands that trembled only slightly, I walked into the local police department. The lobby was bright cleaner than I expected, with posters on the wall about victims' rights and reporting resources. A young officer at the front desk asked how he could help. My throat tightened for a moment before I finally said the words I had rehearsed silently for days. I need to file a report about an assault. He guided me to a small interview room where another officer joined us, a woman with steady eyes and the kind of calm presence that makes even the most painful truths feel survivable. She began by asking me to start from the beginning, not the beginning of the compliance crisis, not the beginning of my family's dysfunction, the beginning of the violence. I told her what happened in the parking garage. I told her how Jason had called me down after the board meeting. I told her about the shove, the impact, the blackout, the hospital. I told her about the lingering dizziness and the documented concussion. I told her about the questions the ER nurse asked and the card she left behind. The officer took notes carefully, occasionally asking for clarification, occasionally offering a quiet nod to signal she understood. When I finished, she asked the question that finally broke through every layer of obedience my family had conditioned into me. Why didn't you report it earlier? I stared at my hands for a long moment before answering. Because my family told me to stay quiet, because they did not want the company to look unstable, because they wanted to protect him. She nodded again, her pen paused above the page. And who protected you? The question sat between us with a heaviness that felt both painful and liberating. No one, I said. After filing the report, she explained the next steps. An investigator would follow up. My medical records would be requested. Jason would be contacted. Depending on the findings, charges could follow. As she spoke, a strange calm washed over me. Not relief, not triumph. Something quieter. Something like alignment. For the first time, my experience existed in writing somewhere other than my own memory. It existed in a system that did not silence or deny or excuse. That afternoon, I informed HR that I had filed a report. The representative's tone shifted instantly. Not rude, not panicked, simply alert. She asked for documentation. She asked whether I needed workplace accommodations. She asked if I wanted to begin the process of requesting a protective order. The words protective order felt surreal. I had spent years normalizing Jason's temper, teaching myself to absorb the volatility because confronting it only made the family tighten around him. Now the system was offering me something my own parents never had: protection. Over the next 2 weeks, HR conducted an internal investigation. They interviewed me. They interviewed employees who had witnessed Jason's anger in the office before. They reviewed security footage of him entering the garage at the time he contacted me. They requested my hospital discharge papers. They asked whether anyone in leadership attempted to influence my account of the incident. They documented everything in a report that would later be presented to the board. At the same time, the board requested an external review from a law firm specializing in corporate misconduct. They interviewed compliance teams. They reviewed credentialing histories. They examined the timeline of events from the leadership change through the fallout. They compared my communications to Jason's. They noted discrepancies. They flagged risks. They compiled findings. Meanwhile, the police investigator contacted me twice for follow-up. She requested additional details. She requested the names of anyone who knew where I was that night. She requested access to my medical file. I gave permission for everything. 3 weeks later, I received a call. The investigator informed me that the evidence supported the report. My concussion, the timeline, the witness absence, the behavior patterns. She recommended moving forward with charges of assault. I thanked her and sat silently after hanging up my fingers, lightly touching the healed bruise behind my ear. The price of violence was finally being paid, not because I screamed louder, but because I stopped participating in the silence that shielded him. At the company, the consequences followed swiftly. HR placed Jason on administrative leave pending investigation. The board issued a statement to directors acknowledging leadership misconduct. Hospital networks requested updated compliance certifications and expressed concern over leadership instability. Our legal counsel advised Jason to refrain from contacting me. My parents reacted exactly as expected. They called. They pleaded. They insisted this could ruin his future. They insisted family matters should be handled privately. They insisted I withdraw the report. But something inside me had hardened, something that used to bend instinctively whenever they asked me to accommodate his flaws had snapped the night he shoved me. I told them the truth. I told them the report was staying. I told them the investigation would continue. I told them I was not protecting him anymore. My mother cried. My father accused me of destroying the company. But neither of them said the one thing that would have mattered. Neither of them asked how I was healing. Neither of them apologized. Neither of them acknowledged that what happened in that garage was violence. And that silence was the final confirmation of why this process needed to happen. Jason had built his life on the certainty that consequences were things other people experienced. But the system had no loyalty to him. It cared only about truth documentation and harm. And the truth was simple. Violence has a price, and he was finally paying it. The weeks after filing the police report and watching the company initiate its internal investigation felt strangely hollow at first, as if my body had finally slowed enough for my mind to notice how much it had been carrying long before the shove in the parking garage. Healing was not cinematic. It was not dramatic. It was not a straight upward climb toward strength. It was quiet, repetitive, often lonely work that demanded patience I did not always have. My concussion symptoms lingered longer than I expected. Some mornings the world tilted slightly when I sat up too fast. Some nights the headache pulsed behind my eyes like a heartbeat I could not calm. Light sensitivity made computer screens feel harsher, and I learned to dim every device I used. The neurologist warned me recovery would take time and that pushing myself too hard could prolong the symptoms. For someone who had spent years solving crises at 2 a.m. and reading regulatory manuals like they were bedtime stories, slowing down felt unnatural. But I forced myself to follow instructions. I attended follow-up appointments even when they felt inconvenient. I completed the cognitive tests even when they felt humiliating, especially the memory exercises that left me frustrated when I could not recall sequences quickly. The doctor reminded me repeatedly that concussion recovery is not a test of intelligence, but a test of rest. Rest had never been something I excelled at. At night, I woke from dreams that felt more like echoes of the garage than nightmares. Sometimes I jolted awake to the sound of my own breath catching the way it had right before I hit the column. Sometimes the darkness felt too familiar. I started sleeping with a small lamp on not because I feared the dark, but because I feared the memory of it. Therapy became part of the routine too. At first, I resisted the idea, telling myself that I could sort through the emotional fallout on my own. But the social worker from the hospital had followed up gently, reminding me that trauma does not dissipate with time. It settles deeper. So I found a therapist who specialized in survivors of family violence. Someone who understood that the hardest part was not the physical injury, but the betrayal wrapped around it. In our first session, she asked me what I wanted out of therapy. I stared at the floor for a long moment before saying, "I want my body to stop reacting to him." She nodded, understanding more in that one sentence than my parents had in 26 years. We talked about the instinctive tightening in my chest whenever my phone buzzed unexpectedly, the way footsteps behind me in parking lots made my pulse spike, the way certain tones of voice triggered instinctive retreat. She explained how trauma lodges itself in the nervous system, how it trains the body to anticipate harm long after the threat is gone. She taught me grounding techniques, small exercises that brought me back into my body when panic tried to pull me out of it. I practiced them daily. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the panic softened. Not disappeared, but softened. Meanwhile, the company continued its investigations. Every email I received from HR or the external law firm reminded me I was part of something larger than my personal healing. But the difference now was that I no longer felt responsible for managing everyone else's crises. I answered questions when necessary, provided documentation when requested, and then returned to my recovery. I no longer stayed up worrying about Jason's reaction or my parents' disappointment. I no longer felt compelled to explain myself. Their discomfort was not my emergency. My therapist helped me understand that a major part of healing from family violence is learning to detach from the narratives that once kept you compliant. She asked me who I was when I wasn't holding the family together. It was a harder question than I expected. For years, I had shaped my identity around responsibility. I was the reliable one, the steady one, the one who fixed things quietly. Without that role, I wasn't sure what remained. But the more I healed physically, the more I realized there were parts of myself that had been waiting beneath the exhaustion. I remembered I liked cooking simple meals that made my apartment smell like home. I remembered I liked reading novels unrelated to compliance or federal regulations. I remembered I liked walking after sunset when the air cooled and the city lights softened the horizon. I remembered I liked my own company. The more I rebuilt my body, the more my life began to expand around me. I took short walks at first, staying close to my building in case the dizziness returned. Then longer ones around the neighborhood. Then longer routes through the nearby park. Movement felt like reclaiming something I didn't know I had lost. I began sleeping more consistently, the nightmares fading from violent flashes to muted echoes. I started eating better. I drank more water than I had in years. I let myself rest without guilt. My therapist reminded me that healing is not about becoming the person you were before the harm. It's about becoming the person you could have been if you had not been taught to shrink. That sentence stayed with me. Shrinking had become second nature around Jason, around my parents, around anyone who believed obedience was the same as love. Healing meant expanding again, slowly, intentionally, without apology. During week 8, I returned to the office for the first time, not to work, but to attend a scheduled meeting with HR and corporate counsel. Walking through the building felt surreal, familiar yet foreign. The fluorescent lights hummed the way they always had. The carpet smelled faintly of industrial cleaner. The break room still held the same coffee machine that burned everything it brewed. But I felt different moving through that space. More aware. More grounded. More present. I took the elevator instead of the stairs because my therapist suggested anything that minimized physical strain would help regulate my anxiety. When the elevator doors opened on the top floor, HR guided me into a conference room where my participation in the investigation was formally documented. They asked clear, precise questions. They asked about timelines. They asked about my medical recovery. They asked whether Jason had attempted any contact. They asked whether I felt safe in the workplace. For once, the questions did not feel like traps. They felt like support. Corporate counsel reviewed the legal options available to me: a protective order, medical leave extensions, documentation for the district attorney, recommendations for workplace safety plans. I listened without fear. For the first time, the company was treating my safety as a priority rather than a complication. After the meeting, I walked to my old office not to work, but to gather the last few belongings I had left behind. Standing in that room felt like standing in the old version of myself. The woman who worked there had been capable, efficient, steady, and exhausted beyond recognition. She had carried the weight of the company in silence because she believed silence was loyalty. She had protected people who never protected her. I touched the back of the chair where I had spent so many late nights completing filings that Jason never bothered to skim. And then I stepped out of that room without looking back. Healing is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is not glamorous. It is reclaiming small pieces of yourself day by day until one morning you wake up and realize the person staring back at you in the mirror is no longer the one who flinches instinctively at the sound of someone else's footsteps. She is someone rebuilding, someone expanding, someone choosing herself. My body was healing. My mind was healing. My sense of self was healing. I was not rebuilding just a career. I was rebuilding a life. Leaving the company was not a single moment, but a gradual recognition that staying would require shrinking myself back into the shape my family preferred, a shape that no longer fit the person I was becoming. The internal investigation was still in motion, the legal review still unfolding, and the district attorney's office had begun reviewing my case. But somewhere between the therapy sessions and the long walks through the park, I realized I did not want to rebuild my life inside the walls that had normalized my silence for years. I deserved more than survival. I deserved autonomy. The decision came quietly one morning as I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold beside my laptop. I opened an email from a hospital compliance coordinator thanking me for my clarity during the credentialing corrections and asking whether I had ever considered consulting independently. The question sat in my mind like a stone dropped into still water. Consulting, working for myself, setting the terms. For years, people had relied on my expertise without recognizing it. Now someone was asking for it directly. That morning, I drafted a business plan with the same precision I once applied to federal filings. I outlined services, credentialing, preparation, audit, support, compliance, training, risk mitigation, regulatory updates. I researched LLC formation requirements and tax implications. I designed a workflow that prioritized the things I valued: accuracy, transparency, and respect for the systems that protected patients and providers. I chose the name Meridian Compliance Services because Meridian meant alignment, balance, clarity. All things I wanted my work and my life to reflect. I filed the paperwork online with a calm certainty that surprised me. Establishing an LLC felt strangely liberating, as if I were reclaiming the authority my family had always assumed I lacked. When the confirmation email arrived 20 minutes later, I stared at it with a mix of disbelief and pride. For the first time in my professional life, my name was not hidden beneath someone else's title. It stood on its own. That same week, I drafted my resignation letter. It was short, professional, and free of emotion. I thanked the company for the opportunities it had provided. I confirmed that my remaining responsibilities had been transitioned appropriately. I stated my last official day. I did not mention this garage. I did not mention Jason. I did not mention the investigation. I did not mention the years of invisibility. My departure did not need to be dramatic to be final. HR responded with formality requesting an exit interview. Corporate counsel sent a follow-up email acknowledging my decision and wishing me well. Jason did not contact me at all, which was its own kind of closure. My parents attempted to call, leaving long voicemails filled with disappointment and warnings about the implications of leaving the family business. They insisted I was making an emotional decision. They insisted loyalty was more important than pride. They insisted I was abandoning the legacy. But legacy meant nothing if it required erasing myself. I deleted the voicemails without listening to them fully. My therapist called that emotional boundary progress. Once the resignation was complete, I turned my attention fully to Meridian. The work came almost immediately. The first hospital that reached out asked whether I could review their compliance logs to prepare for an upcoming audit. I spent 2 days restructuring their files, identifying vulnerabilities, and drafting a corrective action plan. When I submitted the final report, they responded with gratitude and a request for ongoing consulting. 2 more hospitals followed. Then, a regional network asked whether I could support their credentialing updates for new partnerships. The work felt familiar but lighter, free of the tension I had carried in my previous role. I could breathe in ways I had not realized I had been holding back. There were no boardroom politics, no family scripts, no pressure to stay invisible. My value was recognized not because of my last name, but because of my expertise. The more I worked, the more I realized how suffocating the old environment had been. At the company, every contribution felt questioned or diminished. At Meridian, my work was received with respect. It was strange at first being treated as the authority I had quietly been all along. But the strangeness eventually gave way to something gentler: confidence. The company's external auditors reached out within a month requesting clarification on several credentialing issues. I answered their questions professionally, referring them to the appropriate documentation and advising them to contact corporate counsel for details regarding leadership changes. I did not volunteer information. I did not intervene. Their issues were no longer my emergencies. The company would either correct its structural weaknesses or face the consequences of neglect. Either way, my part in that story had ended. Meanwhile, the police investigation progressed steadily. The detective updated me periodically, letting me know the case was moving through the proper channels. She never pressured me. She simply informed me. For the first time in my life, the process surrounding Jason's actions was not controlled by my parents' opinions or the family's preferred version of events. It was controlled by evidence, and evidence has no allegiance to denial. During week 12, I secured my first long-term consulting contract. A hospital network hired me to manage their annual compliance renewal and support their internal training initiatives. It was the kind of work I had once done quietly in the shadows for my family's company, except now it belonged to me. The night I signed the contract, I sat alone in my apartment and let myself feel the full weight of what I had built. Not out of vengeance, not out of fear, out of possibility. Meridian had become more than a business. It had become a boundary, a declaration that I would no longer confine myself to the spaces others assigned to me. I no longer needed to prove myself to my family. I no longer needed their approval. I no longer needed the validation I had chased for years. The structure I was building now rested on my terms, on my expertise, on my healing, on my autonomy. One evening, I received an email from the compliance director who had first asked whether I had considered consulting. She wrote that my work had already improved their system and that she admired how calmly I navigated complex legal requirements. She said she hoped I knew my value. I sat with that message for a long time. My family had never spoken to me that way, not once. And maybe that was why I had clung so tightly to the company for so many years. I kept waiting for acknowledgement that was never coming. Now I no longer needed it. I was building my life the way I built compliance structures, carefully, deliberately, with attention to every detail. A new structure on my terms, and for the first time, the future felt like something I owned. The final conversation did not arrive with drama or shouting or slammed doors. It arrived on a quiet Sunday morning in late spring when the air was soft and the sunlight felt almost apologetic as it filtered through my blinds. I had just finished reviewing a hospital's credentialing checklist when my phone buzzed with a text from my mother asking if I could come by the house. No urgency, no guilt, no implied shame, just a request. After months of silence that alone was surprising, I stared at the message for a long time before replying that I would stop by later in the afternoon. The drive to my parents' house felt strangely detached, as if the roads themselves belonged to a past life. The neighborhood looked the same, but I felt different. I was not the daughter fighting for space or the employee trying to prove her worth. I was the woman who had built a company from nothing after surviving something that should never have happened. When I pulled into the driveway, Jason's car was already there. My chest tightened involuntarily, not with fear, but with recognition. There were conversations that could be delayed and conversations that would eventually find you, no matter how long you tried to outrun them. This was the latter. My mother opened the door before I even knocked. She looked older than I remembered, not in a frail way, but in the way someone looks when months of worry finally settle into their features. She hugged me gently as if testing whether the gesture was still allowed. I did not pull away, but I did not melt into her either. Boundaries were strange like that, always shifting between what was familiar and what was newly defined. "Your father is in the living room," she said softly, "and your brother is here too. We just want to talk." Want was a generous word. Need was probably more accurate. I walked into the living room and found Jason standing by the window. For the first time in my life, he looked uncertain, not remorseful and not ashamed, just uncertain. My father sat on the couch, hands clasped tightly, his posture straighter than usual, as if bracing himself for an impact he knew he deserved. I sat in the armchair across from them. I did not wait for them to set the tone. I had learned the cost of silence. So I asked the question that had been sitting inside me for months, like a splinter that refused to dissolve. Why now? My father answered first. Because things cannot continue like this. Because the investigation is nearing its end. Because the company is changing. Because we are changing. The reasons fell flat. They were convenient, but not complete. I waited. My mother sat down beside him and took a slow breath. "Because we miss you," she said. Her voice trembled slightly. "And because we finally understand that missing you does not give us the right to your life." That sentence surprised me more than anything else. It was the first time she had acknowledged that love without accountability is not love at all. Jason turned toward me but did not sit. I expected defensiveness or blame, or one of his familiar excuses wrapped in apology-shaped words. Instead, he said quietly, "I know I cannot take back what happened. I know it." That was all he managed before his voice thinned into silence. I let the moment stretch. It was not cruelty. It was clarity. For years he had filled silence with explanations that absolved him. Now he was forced to sit with the weight of what he had done. "I am not here for an apology," I said. "Apologies do not fix structural damage. They do not undo trauma. They do not rewrite the memory of cold concrete against the back of my head." I saw both of my parents flinch at that. I continued before anyone could fill the air with discomfort. "I am here to tell you the truth. All of it." I spoke calmly and evenly, not to provoke, but to anchor myself. I told them about the hospital DV protocol, the nurse who had seen through my lie, the social worker who had left a hotline card tucked against my pillow. I told them about the fear that clung to me for weeks, the sound of footsteps behind me that made my stomach twist the way I slept with the lights on for nearly a month. I told them about therapy, about the flashbacks, about the way my jaw clenched when someone raised their voice unexpectedly. I was not dramatic. I was not emotional. I was factual. The truth was heavy enough on its own. My mother began crying quietly, but she did not interrupt. My father listened unmoved in posture, but visibly shaken. Jason stared at the floor. When I finished, I folded my hands together. "I am healing," I said, "and I am rebuilding." But healing does not mean returning things to the way they were. This is where boundaries come in. Jason finally lifted his eyes and asked, "What does that mean for us?" Not with entitlement, not with anger, with uncertainty. I appreciated that honesty more than anything he had ever offered. "It means I do not hate you," I said, "but I also do not trust you. Trust requires safety. Safety requires consistency, and consistency requires time. A long time." He nodded slowly. It was not acceptance, but recognition. My father cleared his throat as if preparing to negotiate something, then stopped himself. Even that small restraint felt like progress. "You are right," he said. "You set the terms now." "I am not setting terms out of revenge," I replied. "I am setting terms out of self-respect. I will not pretend this family is whole. I will not pretend everything can return to normal. But I am willing to have conversations if they happen under one condition: honesty." My mother nodded through her tears. Jason whispered, "I can do that." I looked at him and said, "You will need to, because your choices have consequences. Not because you are my brother, not because we share a name. Because you harmed someone, and now you must rebuild trust like anyone else." The room felt still, not hostile, not warm, just still. I stood up after a few moments. I was not running from them, and I was not rushing toward reconciliation. I was simply choosing the space that allowed me to breathe. Before leaving, I said one last thing. I do not know where our relationship will land. I do not know what the next year will look like. But I know this: we cannot rebuild anything based on silence or denial. If you want me in your lives, it will be because you choose responsibility over comfort. I walked out without waiting for reassurance or promises. I did not need them. Boundaries do not require permission. When I stepped outside, the late afternoon sun felt steady and warm. It did not feel like closure delivered with dramatic flair. It felt like something quieter and more powerful: self-direction. The final conversation had not repaired what was broken. It had simply named it. And sometimes naming a wound is the first step toward choosing a different kind of future. Closure did not arrive like a verdict or a victory march. It settled gradually over ordinary days and quiet mornings in the space where grief and growth finally stopped wrestling each other. Months had passed since the final conversation with my family. The investigations had concluded. The board had settled into a new operational structure. My consulting agency had expanded into a full compliance firm with 3 additional consultants and a part-time administrative assistant. None of these milestones felt like dramatic turning points. They felt like the steady accumulation of a life rebuilt on my terms. The consequences for Jason unfolded just as quietly. He did not return as CEO. The board cited leadership instability, unresolved liability exposure, and the ongoing impact of the incident on public trust. It was not a scandal splashed across headlines, and it was not a dramatic public firing. It was a controlled internal transition, the kind that wealthy family companies excel at. He was moved into a non-executive role without decision-making authority while the board restructured leadership. On paper, it sounded gentle. In reality, it was the kind of demotion that stripped him of everything he had spent his life believing he was entitled to. He lost the presidency he had been groomed for his entire childhood. He lost the silent privileges that came with power. He lost the ability to walk into a room and assume the world would shift around him. But the title was the smallest thing he lost. What he truly lost was the network of quiet protection that had always kept him insulated. For the first time in his life, actions had consequences that could not be smoothed over by our father or disguised under company reputation. Board members who once praised him now kept their distance. Department heads who had tolerated his temper became guarded around him. Even the employees who used to laugh nervously at his jokes no longer saw him as someone untouchable. His arrogance slid off him like heavy fabric he could no longer hold up. I saw all of this from a distance. Not with satisfaction and not with pity, just with clarity. People often assume closure requires forgiveness or reconciliation, but what I felt was something quieter, a grounded sense that the responsibility had finally shifted back to the person who caused the harm. He carried the weight of his choices now. It was no longer mine to carry. Meanwhile, my own life expanded. Hospitals that had once seen me as just another compliance officer now sought me out for independent audits. Administrators referred colleagues to me. 2 regional systems hired my firm to oversee credentialing and regulatory filings for entire networks. My name was finally being spoken in rooms where competence mattered more than hierarchy. I moved into a new apartment on the 4th floor of a modest but bright building with large windows that overlooked a quiet street. It was the first place I chose without worrying whether my family approved. I decorated slowly with things that made me feel grounded. Plants, neutral colors, a wooden table that felt warm and solid. Healing was not a dramatic transformation. It was the slow rebuilding of trust in my own judgment after years of minimizing myself to keep the peace. Therapy continued. So did physical recovery. I still experienced occasional flashes of dizziness when I turned too quickly, and sometimes loud footsteps behind me in a parking lot made my chest tighten. But fear no longer dictated my life. Awareness replaced it. Strength grew quietly. I watched my parents navigate the wreckage in their own ways. My mother sent short messages from time to time asking how I was never pushing, never assuming access. My father stayed silent for weeks at a time before sending an occasional update about the company that felt more like an olive branch than an intrusion. They were trying. Slowly. Not perfectly, but trying. And I learned something unexpected. Closure is not the moment when everything becomes peaceful between you and the people who hurt you. Closure is when you stop needing them to understand you in order to move forward. I no longer waited for apologies or emotional awakenings or proof that they finally valued me. I no longer hoped the family would return to what it had been because what it had been was built on silence and denial and misplaced loyalty. What I carried with me now was different. It was the knowledge that protecting myself was not selfish. It was necessary. One evening in early fall, I ran into Jason outside the administrative building where the company's annual meeting had just finished. I had been there to speak with a hospital network representative about a new compliance proposal. He had been there as a non-voting observer, a shadow of the role he used to occupy. We stood a few feet apart on the sidewalk. The sun was setting behind him, casting his face in muted light. He looked tired, not physically, tired in the way someone looks when the story he built about himself has finally collapsed. "Hi," he said quietly. I nodded. We did not make small talk. We did not revisit the past. After a long silence, he asked a question so simple it startled me. "Are you okay?" I answered truthfully. "I am." He nodded slowly and whispered, "Good," not because it absolved him, not because he believed it earned him anything, just because it was the first time he had expressed something without expecting a return. For a brief moment, I saw the brother he might have been in another life, one not shaped by entitlement or unchecked power. But I also saw clearly the distance I needed to maintain. Closure was not an open door. It was a steady boundary. When I walked away, I felt no anger, no triumph. Just a quiet fullness, the kind that comes when you know the story no longer defines you. Months later, my consulting firm signed its largest contract, yet a multi-year compliance oversight agreement with a hospital network that spanned 3 states. The email confirming it arrived early one morning as I sat at my kitchen table sipping coffee. I smiled, not because of the money or the prestige, but because of what it represented. I had built a life that did not rely on the approval or permission of the people who once underestimated me. The final piece of closure arrived not with words, but with awareness. My brother lost his title. He lost the identity he believed was guaranteed. He lost the power that once controlled every room. But I gained something far greater, the ability to walk into any room without apologizing for my existence. Closure was not what I lost. Closure was what I finally allowed myself to claim. If you stayed with me through this story, then maybe you have lived through your own version of silence and blame and family expectations that asked you to carry more than your share. Maybe you know what it feels like to protect the people who never protected you back, or to shrink yourself to keep the peace in a house that was never peaceful for you. If so, I want to tell you something clearly and gently. You are not wrong for wanting safety, and you are not selfish for choosing it. There comes a moment in every life when you stop waiting for someone else to hand you permission to stand up for yourself. Sometimes that moment arrives quietly in a hospital room with a nurse who sees more than you say. Sometimes it arrives in the slow ache of healing when your body forces you to listen to what your soul has been whispering for years. And sometimes it arrives in the steady realization that you cannot fix people who refuse accountability no matter how deeply you once loved them. The truth is, families are complicated in ways that outsiders will never fully understand. But complexity does not excuse harm. Tradition does not excuse silence. Loyalty does not excuse losing yourself. What I learned and what I hope you carry with you is this. You can love people and still place limits. You can care about them and still protect your own peace. You can walk away from patterns that break you even when those patterns come from the people who share your blood. Standing up for yourself does not make you the villain in someone else's story. It makes you the author of your own. And if there is one thing I hope you remember long after this video ends, it is that closure is not given, it is chosen. It is built day by day in the small decisions to take yourself seriously, in the quiet courage of redefining your boundaries, and in the steady reclamation of your worth. So wherever you are listening from, whether it is a kitchen table at the end of a long day or the front seat of your car outside a job that drains you or a bedroom where you are finally learning to rest, I want you to know this. Your life still belongs to you. Your story is not finished, and the chapters ahead can be different from the ones behind. If you have ever been told to stay quiet to protect the family name or to keep the peace at the cost of your own well-being, consider this your sign that you deserve more. You deserve safety. You deserve respect. You deserve to walk into every room without apologizing for taking up space. Thank you for listening, and if any part of this story touched something in you, I hope you stay for the next one. Tell me where you are listening from today.